a few days ago, the Russian Black Sea Fleet retreated from its base in Crimea to Novorossiysk on the eastern shore of the Black Sea. This is a retreat under pressure from the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have been launching strategic attacks against Russian military targets. Notice military targets, not civilian targets. And these attacks appear to be mostly symbolic, but in recent weeks they've appeared to be strategic. So this is a major success on the part of the Ukrainians.
At least 51 people have been killed today in the Kharkiv region following a Russian attack on a cafe where people had gathered for a memorial service. It appears to be one of the biggest civilian death tolls in a single Russian strike since the start of the war. Let's talk to Daniel Fried, who is former US Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. And Daniel, you were US Ambassador to Poland. Good evening. Thanks for joining us.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
Today is day 589 of this war and one of the deadliest single attacks, the attack on that supermarket in the village of Roza. Your reaction when you heard?
The Russians have been targeting civilians since the beginning of their aggressive war against Ukraine. They appear to target them deliberately, or at least they are guilty of gross and repeated negligence. But I think it is deliberate targeting of civilians. The Russians intend to terrorize Ukrainians and to get them to give up their struggle for their country by simply bearing down on them. So it struck me as both terrible and another example of war crimes committed by the Kremlin.
War crimes, but with little prospect of those war crimes being punished in a court someday.
That's true, though never is a long time. It's Russian history over the past 40 years has been marked by discontinuities, so I would not make a long-term bet on Putin. However, you have a point. In the immediate term, what we can do is help Ukraine beat the Russians. Now, a few days ago, the Russian Black Sea Fleet retreated from its base in Crimea to Novorossiysk on the eastern shore of the Black Sea. This is a retreat under pressure from the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have been launching strategic attacks against Russian military targets. Notice military targets, not civilian targets. And these attacks appear to be mostly symbolic, but in recent weeks they've appeared to be strategic. So this is a major success on the part of the Ukrainians. They need more long-range fires to be able to put at risk the Russian military assets in Crimea and the Kerch Strait Bridge and Russian supply lines generally to their forces in occupied southern Ukraine. If the Ukrainians can do this, then they can tip the balance of this war. So it's important to help the Ukrainians actually win, which is
But the clock is ticking, though, isn't it, Daniel? Because we've got chaos on Capitol Hill, and there's no speaker. So when it comes to the budgets that President Biden wants to allocate toward arms for the Ukrainians, that's going to be in peril. And then we've had an election in Slovakia of a pro-Putin potential prime minister, and a further election on the way in Poland, which has promised to stop sending weapons to Ukraine in a grain dispute. It's looking a bit shaky, isn't it?
Well, in the first place, the Poles have walked back what I think were misinterpretations of their of what they said about Ukraine. They are sending weapons. They said they're going to continue to send weapons. And the Polish elections are not likely to change Poland's support for Ukraine. So that's good. In Slovakia, we'll see. I know Robert Fico, the probable next prime minister. He talks one way and has, at least in the past, acted in a more pragmatic fashion. I'm not saying that'll happen this time, but at least it's worth a try, and it's not time yet to throw up our hands in despair over Slovakia. I'm afraid you're right about U.S. political dysfunction. It's a mess, only it's really a mess within the Republican Party, not generally. Nevertheless, U.S. support among both Republicans and Democrats for Ukraine remains high. So this is ugly. You want to avert your eyes. I know I do when you look at American politics. But we may be able to get out of this. And my point is that the Ukrainians can still have a measure of success in this war. That is possible, and we need to put our backs into it.
Mm. One wonders what Vladimir Putin is making of the chaos on Capitol Hill. He's been speaking at a conference in Sochi today, and he was talking about the recent missile tests, hailing them, and also claiming that Russia's economy is resilient despite fighting. His message to his people seems to be, here we are, we're strong, we're stable, we don't have the chaos, that messy US-style fake democracy. What you want is me, your leader, and I'll see you through. And it's going to resonate with a lot of Russians still, isn't it?
Well, Putin would say that. He's very good at the propaganda line and pushing back. He's a clever debater. I've seen him in action before. He's not he's anything but stupid. But the Russian war against Ukraine is not going the way he predicted. The Russian economy is under considerable stress, and it's not an economy that's resilient because it's a top-down economy, sort of run like a mafia gang. Uh, that is not an economy that can show either resilience or creativity. So the Russian deficits are significant, and we shouldn't forget it. So what if he talks a good game? We need to put the pressure on.
And what of, let's bring ourselves back up to date. President Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, participating in the third summit of the European political community in Grenada, calling for a reinforcement of air defense systems. What does he mean, and should he get them?
He means Ukraine should be able to defend itself even more effectively against Russian attacks. Ukrainian air defenses are pretty good. They knock down most of the Russian air attack missiles, but they need to be even better. And I think the Europeans should help supply this. It's also important to be able to give the Ukrainians the ability to launch continued strategic attacks on Russian military targets. The Germans have said they're going to provide another Patriot battery to Ukraine. That's good, but they've said they're not going to provide long-range offensive missiles, and that's unfortunate. So I think we need to help the Ukrainians fight and win their war.
And when it comes to the diplomatic option, and I spend a lot of time in social media, and people are saying, oh, it's ridiculous how they've given up on diplomacy. And one casts one's mind back to the beginning of last year, and you had President Macron going to see President Putin. You had Olaf Scholz. You had all this energy and activity to try and stop the invasion. It happened. And then you had, presidents of Turkey and other countries going to see Putin and talking to him. And then you don't get the impression that very much diplomacy is happening anymore. What do you think about that?
Well, I'm not against diplomacy, but I'm against dumb diplomacy. And it is dumb diplomacy to go racing to the Russians when they have no interest in any kind of a diplomatic settlement except on terms of Ukrainian surrender. They've said so. So don't chase after the Russians and thinking that diplomacy is some kind of magic. If the Russians are serious about a diplomatic solution, they know how to negotiate. These aren't stupid people. I've negotiated with Russians over the years. But when they don't want to negotiate, when they want you to cave, they will just hold to their position, as Gromyko used to, as Molotov used to.
Well, you're going back some, aren't you? Yes, Gromyko and Molotov.
And they will wait for the West to surrender. But that's no basis for negotiations. To make negotiations with Russia work, you have to change the balance of forces to be in your favor. That's when they're interested in talking, and we should hold off racing to the Russians and throwing bouquets at their feet, begging them to show mercy on Ukraine. That's not the way to do it. The way to do it is to push back and then talk.
So in the meantime, more death and destruction, but it's a price that has to be paid.
Death and destruction is Russia's responsibility. Yeah. They could stop this war tomorrow. All right. The Ukrainians are defending themselves.
Sure. Daniel Fried, former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs and former U.S. Ambassador to Poland, thank you very much indeed